Good evening, comrades. Very welcome to our third session in our series, Why Marx? Tonight, we're looking at the Communist Manifesto, which, despite the fact that it's over 170 years old, is still one of the best-selling works of the socialist movement. Millions have read it. It's been translated into more than 1,000 versions in over 200 languages. I've looked that up. That's from 2018, might be even more by now. It's a relatively short text written in 1847 and published a year later, when Karl Marx and Frederick Engels were commissioned by the Communist League, which was a rather small group of like-minded, mainly German communists who were in political exile throughout Europe. And they were commissioned by the League to produce a program for the organization that they thought would help to intervene in the revolutions that were sweeping the rest of Europe and Germany, of course, a few months later. It's a relatively easy read compared to Capital, at least, and sums up much of what Marx and Engels further developed in the decades following these events and the publication. It's also very interesting if you read it to read the various prefaces, because they do in it, especially Engels but Marx also, they correct and tweak various phrases, etc., some of which they called antiquated. For example, they made a little footnote on the quite famous sentence: "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." And Engels had to correct this into written history after he kind of worked out that there was a thing called Urkommunismus, which has been badly translated into primitive communism, which was, pre-class society, pre-written history. We will look at this Urkommunismus a bit more in our session on March the 9th. But despite various smaller corrections, they wanted to leave it as what they call it, a historical document. And because many of its ideas in it remain relevant, it remains a relevant document. And again, young people all over the world are reading it. Gould from the Socialist Theory Study Group will discuss those key ideas. And then later, as a second speaker, Lawrence Parker will look at an interesting aspect that is often overlooked, which is the use and misuse of the manifesto, especially in its various translations, and especially the 1888 English translation. And his contribution could be summarized as the question of party and program. So first, we're going to start with Rob. Welcome.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen here. Does that work? Everyone, you see that okay? Great. Okay. So I'm going to do a talk on, is the Communist Manifesto still relevant today? I'm really going to unpick the Communist Manifesto into themes and explore some of those themes in a bit more detail. So we'll get started. I've only got 20 minutes, so I want to be as concise as possible. So the outline of the presentation is that we're going to start with a little section on the context of manifesto, and then the key themes I've selected to look at are the definition of class, the mode of production, and the critique of the left, as well as political aims of manifesto. There's many more themes that can be explored. You can view this as an environmentalist, as a pacifist, as a feminist, and as an educator, and be presented with takes that are still relevant today. Some of the themes are less poignant now than they were. So the ones I've selected to showcase are the essence of why manifesto is still relevant for critiquing our modern economy. So we'll begin with the context. It's worthy of note that there is excellent literature out there discussing the context of the Communist Manifesto. I'd recommend Hal Draper's Adventures of the Communist Manifesto. It delves deep into the context and translations of manifesto. We're not going to spend too long on this today, but I think there's a few salient points we can make about it. So it was written in 1847 and published in 1848 in what is known as the Springtime of Peoples, the mass revolutionary movement that took place across much of Western Europe, looking to overthrow those regimes. Manifesto is speaking to an emerging revolutionary sentiment of that time. This sentiment was fostered by the material conditions facing the working class, A full exposition can be found in Engels, Condition of the Working Class in England. But to kind of summarize what the condition was, we're looking at high mortality rate for workers, low to non-existent healthcare provision, poor conditions of living in terms of clothing, diet, and shelter. So really a pretty poor state of affairs. Though commissioned by the Communist League, it was aimed at a historical European mass movement and not a particular sect of communists and socialists. Communist Manifesto is reflective of the attitudes of the time and the underdeveloped nature of capitalist expansion under imperialism. It's worthy of note that there is a shift in the attitude of Marx and Engels detectable in later editions that Tina's already alluded to. The preface of 1872 refers to the need for critique to be focused everywhere and at all times on the historical conditions for the time being existing. That's a quote. Asking for less importance to be placed on the revolutionary suggestions at the end of chapter 2. Later editions also consider the migration of industry, with the preface of 1882 of the 1882 edition referring to the growing industrial powers in the USA and in Russia. The aim really is to create a full and substantial exposition of the new revolutionary world outlook. So let's compare that to the context of today. So today we can see there's rising levels of global inequality. The two graphics displayed here highlight the difference in global national income share. We can clearly see that while there is a limited inequality, still an inequality, but it's not as stark as it is in other places. In the Western nations, the industrial producers of commodities globally have a much higher difference in income share. If we look at South Africa, if we look at South America, you can see that the 1% still are retaining between 19 and 31% of national income. India as well is an important place to note here. Obviously, China is, has a different kind of approach, which we'll discuss in future meetings. We've seen an increase in plutocracy in the 21st century, in affecting the governments of all Western nations, as the social state is being slowly reduced and the rights thought of as fundamental are now being called into question. The so-called cost of living crisis bites down on the conditions of the lowest earners and shapes the new kindling of political awakening with the strike action that we've been seeing in present months. But if we look at this next line graph, we can see the beginning of a resurgence in Western nations of the 1%. If you look here, you can see clearly that there's a big spike towards the end of the 20th century in the income share of the 1%. In the nations that I've highlighted there. So it's clawing back income share. It is no accident that this percentile increase coincides with a decrease in living standards for working people. While we in the West don't live in the same conditions as the 19th century, we are still subject to disease. The COVID epidemic, I think, highlights this more than anyone. Affected workers in a much bigger way than other parts of society, namely in the fact that many couldn't afford to isolate or worked in key sectors during the pandemic, meaning that class, now as then, still determines your health. But let's not also overlook climate change. The impending crisis that will emerge from rising global temperatures will predominantly affect the poorest nations, while being created by big industries' continual need for overproduction and dirty energy. So on to an analysis of Manifesto. So first area I'm looking at is the definition of class. There's a key addition to Manifesto in 1888 where Engels tries to really lay out in clear terms what he means by proletariat and what he means by bourgeoisie. By bourgeoisie, and this is the quote, by bourgeoisie is meant the class of modern capitalists, owners of the means of social production and employers of wage labour. By proletariat, the class of modern wage labourers who have no means of production of their own are reduced to selling their labour power in order to live. So throughout chapters 1 and 2, Manifesto places the bourgeoisie and the proletariat in direct opposition to each other. It places the origin of this class relation in the coming to power of the bourgeois class during the Industrial Revolution. A quote that sums it up would be the bourgeoisie has at last, since the establishment of modern industry and of the world market, conquered for itself in the modern representative state exclusive political sway. The only equal distribution of wealth and exploitative nature of wage labour is at the heart of this analysis. The relationship is subject to constant change as the bourgeoisie continually alter and develop the means of production and creates uncertainty and agitation in the proletariat as their working conditions come under threat by new developments. There is also comment on what they term the lumpen proletariat. This is people who are scrapped from useful employment and become involved in criminality and are completely impoverished. So these are kind of some important class definitions from Manifesto. So if we are to look at class in the postmodern society, there are some differences in the class structures, namely, as discussed in the opening of the presentation, we have a geographical diaspora of the working class, with kind of the global south taking on the predominant role of the industrial proletariat. So industrial class relations have spread worldwide, with the developing world now showing the starkest contrasts in class referred to in Manifesto. In the West, there has been a definitive attempt to segment the proletariat by income, introducing the notions of upper and lower classes based on the income and specializations of labor. The diagram here represents the way the current class system is presented to us. See the colored labels applied to different forms of income and brackets of that income. On top of this, we have identity being drawn on new lines. So class is no longer the default position of identity. Race, gender, sexuality, it makes it more difficult for us to identify with fellow members of what we could consider the old proletariat. And this really places sections of the working class in opposition to each other. The social state pretends to act as a ladder, allowing all people to become middle class. And the idea that we can all be wealthy is continually rammed down our throat by media outlets all over the world. Despite these obstacles, the original analysis of Manifesto remains broadly true. Your income is most likely to be defined by your opportunities, the opportunities afforded by class. For every lift provided by the social state, there is a bourgeois alternative available for those with the resources to access it. For every success story of entrepreneurial spirit, there are 1,000 failed ones. Class is still defined by those with access to capital and those who have to sell their labor power in order to live. A sale that, as we will come to see, can still be defined as dehumanizing. So the next section I'm going to be looking at is Manifesto and the mode of production. So by mode of production, I refer to the Marxist definition of the relationship of labor to capital. While this is a theme clearly present in Manifesto, Marx's Capital is the real exposition of the mode of production, and I would recommend looking there for further readings on this. So what is the nature of production in Manifesto? So Manifesto highlights that wage labor is exploitative of the worker as they create all commodities and receive only just enough to survive. Manifesto also states that it loses all its individual character in the capitalist mode of production. Machinery drives from labor its creative expression and reduces the input of the worker to a simple knack for controlling the means of production. And it is in this way that it is dehumanized. A good quote from Manifesto to sum this up would be, the proletariat are daily and hourly enslaved by the machine. The cost of that labor is restricted almost entirely to the subsistence of the worker. The bourgeoisie ensure that the worker must continue to sell their labor through control of property, demanding rents and denying the worker opportunity to provide for their own subsistence. At this point, further bourgeoisie descend upon the worker to scoop up what remains of the wage packet, be that via food or via debts or via other commodity purchase. Furthermore, the bourgeoisie constantly revolutionizes production, and in doing so affects the relationship of labor to that production, and thereby alters the whole relations of society, drawing more people into the proletariat, creating the insecurity that characterizes bourgeois production. The bourgeoisie, by comparison, seek to continually expand the mode of production. Marx and Engels explain that they compel all nations, and quote, compel all nations on pain of extinction to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what it calls civilization into their midst. In one word, it creates a world after its own image. This creates a cosmopolitan character to production and consumption in all countries. I think this notion of the pain of extinction is quite significant, especially when we look at conflict in the 20th and 21st centuries, where the wars have taken place. The dismantling of governments didn't align with the interests of global capital, and the replacement of a nice neoliberal kind of figure, model of government, kind of really highlights that this part is particularly still relevant. So let's look at how postmodern labour kind of has shaped out. How has this changed? What's been developments? So in the West, labour has somewhat changed its nature. This doesn't contravene arguments presented in Manifesto, as again, the bourgeoisie continually revolutionise production and alter social relations. So we've seen a shift in the 20th century from factory to the office. We also saw the introduction of the 5-day working week. However, the development of the means of production has created a world where 24-hour labour is not only necessary, but it's normative. And flexible contracts mean that there is no protection for the rights won in the 20th century. IT has led to a bleeding of social and labour time, meaning businesses can claim more labour time from workers. And sales has become the primary role of Western business, and therefore the office is the commonplace of labour as opposed to the factory floor. Beneath this, workers are reduced to holding multiple roles, jobs in the gig economy, a giant floating industrial army that responds to the ebb and flow of capital investment into different industries. Being self-employed in this way has stripped a great deal of protections formerly afforded to workers of this class. The nature of this work has become international, and differences in working conditions between developed nations are really arbitrary and bureaucratic. Greater levels of management and increased commodification has caused a giant de-skilling, as more is expected in the workplace, with pressure to improve efficiency, and the worker must continually rely on commodities and services to perform necessary domestic labour. In the global south, the development of labour has a different character, with conditions more closely resembling those of 19th century European industry. In Bangladesh, for instance, the scrapping of decommissioned ships is performed by workers with power tools and no real means of protection from the dangers they face. The extraction of raw materials and the danger of this labour are pushed into the developing nations. The nations that we saw at the beginning have the greatest disparity in their national income share between the top 1% and the lowest 50%. And many countries still employ child labour, and poverty is rife. So while what I've stated fits with the view of Manifesto, there are some elements that have changed. Development of infrastructure and logistics have led to a process of decentralization that took place in the 20th century, with industry centres being widespread and separated from the centres of capital, which we could consider to be the capital cities of nations, where the skyscrapers and the high-rises kind of visually represent that, those places as the centres of capital. So moving on, So other lefts. So let's talk about other left groups and Manifesto on the left. So other left groups referenced in Manifesto. Marx and Engels really pulled no punches when critiquing the work of other leftists. The focus of chapter 3 is on communist and socialist literature. They break down
Rob, just a second, sorry to interrupt you. I'm wondering if you're moving back and forth, because sometimes you hear you quite loudly and then you kind of disappear a little bit. I wonder if your microphone is not plugged in properly, or if you are moving.
It's probably my rocking.
So you're rocking back and forth.
I'll move closer.
Okay, thank you. Great.
So Marx and Engels really pulled no punches when critiquing the work of other leftists. The focus of chapter 3 is on communist and socialist literature. They break down the existing literature into 3 distinct camps. First, they dub reactionary socialists, and then subcategorizes these reactionary socialists into 3 further areas of this school of thought. We will not dwell on this, as their modern relevance is somewhat lost, but the second group is the bourgeois socialists. Marx and Engels named Proudhon in this group. They state that these socialists seek to elevate the proletariat to become equal to the bourgeoisie, but they fail to recognize the fundamental opposition between the mode of production and the proletariat. A good quote that kind of sums up the view of Manifesto on bourgeois socialism is free trade for the benefit of the working class, protective duties for the benefit of the working class, prison reform for the benefit of the working class. This last word, and the only seriously meant word for the bourgeois socialism. It is summed up in the phrase, the bourgeois is a bourgeois for the benefit of the working class. The final group to come under fire is the critical utopian socialists and communists. Marx and Engels critique this group as being unwilling to participate in revolution. A quote here that sums this up would be: the economic situation as they find it does not yet offer to them the material conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. They therefore search after a new social science, after new social laws that are to create these conditions. So how does this apply to today? So a lot of the elements of this critique can still be applied to those of the left. It didn't take long to look at the Labour Party website to find a quote that ties them solidly to the features of bourgeois socialism. Labour will work with businesses to carry out a transparent and honest analysis of all the holes in the Prime Minister's deal. We will work out how to fill them fast without the risk of trade wars during a cost of living crisis, without erecting further barriers to cooperation with our allies, without the need for even more years of painful negotiations. We will seek to strike trade deals around the world that prioritize jobs, businesses, livelihoods, and will promote labour values. Marx and Engels put it succinctly: the bourgeois is a bourgeois for the working class. See that there. To a certain extent, you could lump Corbyn in with bourgeois socialism, as he wasn't proposing to change the nature of property. He wasn't proposing, to do anything that would be truly radical to the state of the current economy. I found the critique of the critical utopian socialist to be quite personally challenging. It has, in a way, made me a little bit more aware of previous political views I have held about how to progress society towards communism. They are dismissed as failed revolutionaries who have devolved into mere reactionary sects that hold fast by the original views of their masters, in opposition to the historical development of the proletariat. There is some saving grace here, as it is stated that socialist and communist publications of this nature do contain a necessary critical element. They attack every principle of existing society and can prove to create valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class. So in that, even if you have at times in your leftist career held by these kind of notions, you can still work towards intellectual enlightenment. But the revolution, the key difference would be the revolutionary tendency in literature of this nature. So next we come on to the political aims of Manifesto. So it attempts to start to lay out the start of revolutionary society in a number of ways. As mentioned at the beginning, Manifesto seek to guide revolutionary movements to creating the communist society. At the end of chapter 2, which I've kind of already dismissed, but we'll cover it anyway, we see a clear 10-point plan of how a society should proceed. I'm not going to list them all. That would be laborious for you and for me, but include highlights. So some of the highlights are the abolition of private property, graduated income tax, removal of inheritance rights, a national bank that has exclusive monopoly, and an end to gold and silver currency, nationalization of communication and transport, universal right to work, universal education, as well as a more even spread of combined industry and the restoration of waste land. These measures were somewhat dismissed in 1871 as deserving no special attention and subject to change depending on historical conditions. There was a real international thrust in what they wanted to achieve from Manifesto. Marx and Engels here sought to end the exploitation of one nation by another. And it's clear they also wanted to do this without making despotic inroads into the lives of the proletariat. So they didn't really want to set up some kind of all-powerful dictatorship. So their aim was elevating the proletariat to be the ruling class and to ensure that they could have subsistence without exploitation. They saw this as being achievable through uniting and enlightening the proletariat and then having a revolution. So there was a degree in the modern state, there is a degree of materialization of some of these aims. Of the aims of Manifesto, a few have been carried into the state model. We have a graduated income tax, we have universal education, child labour has been ended in the Western model, mostly. We have nationalised services and land held for the public by the state. We have an ensured support for the unemployed through job seekers allowance and disability benefit. A lot of these state reforms came through in the 20th century and were hard won by the political action of the proletariat. This corresponds to the graph that I looked at the beginning, the line graph, which shows a clear dip in the income percentile of the top 1% from the 1920s onwards. But then answer me this, of these reforms, how many have evaded a bastardization by the state? Income tax is flaunted by those earning the most and those in positions of power. Education is a bourgeois institution with a focus on developing the entrepreneurial skill of the next generation and institutionalizing young people to follow orders blindly. Child labor, while disappeared mostly from the economic West, is still prevalent in the global South. A cobalt mining child in the DRC is still born into below subsistence labor, and the products of this labor we carry in our pockets for our own entertainment. The nationalized services, such as the NHS, are being eroded from under us, and public land is hawked off to the highest bidder for property development. Unemployment benefit has been tightened and squeezed to such a degree that there is a widespread reliance on food banks for the subsistence of the lumpen proletariat and proletariat alike. The question emerges, how much of these reforms were done to support the working class? Or was the real aim the suppression of revolutionary spirit? And now all alternative models of production have been subsumed, we are to return to business as usual for the capitalist class, the expropriation of wealth and the return to full exploitation. So to conclude, Manifesto has a great conclusion. It's been quoted a number of times. I'm going to go over it again anyway. In short, the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. In all these movements, they bring to the front as the leading question in each, the property question, no matter what its degree of development at the time. Finally, they labor everywhere for the union and agreement of the democratic parties of all countries. And the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. Let the ruling classes tremble at a communistic revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. The historical conditions of the proletariat have changed. The landscape we are faced with is altered. But with this in mind, there are some sections of Manifesto that have lost their relevance to modern society. Marx and Engels knew that and said as much with the changing relations of labor. The diaspora of proletariat has changed what can be achieved in a single continent, but the critique remains valid. From definitions of class to political aims of communists, there are lessons for us in this text. We must continue to analyze our society through the lens of Communist Manifesto and address the imbalance we are faced with. Addressing the issue of property remains a prominent area of struggle, and we must remain vigilant to those who would attempt to suppress our revolutionary spirit. We must at all times be working towards a fairer world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. Very interesting points. I think you emphasized the relevance, what's still relevant compared to 170 years ago. We're still in capitalism, we still have a working class and a bourgeoisie, etc., etc. There's going to be some things that no doubt some comrades will disagree with, and we'll have some time for debate later. Should also stress that we have a separate section on the working class, and if there still is a working class, and we'll be delving into that more in 2 weeks' time. Some people might also disagree with the analysis of the Labour Party as one of those organizations, but it was certainly an interesting outline. Thank you very much. We're now turning to a separate issue, but it's very much contained in the Communist Manifesto. And if like me, and lots of you have been involved in the Labour Party over the last few years during the Corbyn period, you will probably have come across some smart left Labourite who's told you that Marx and Engels explicitly argued that communists should never try to build an organization based on Marxist principles, communist principles. Instead, Marxists have to work in the Labour Party or wait for the unions to set up a new organizations in which the Marxists inevitably have to be the minority. Building a communist or Marxist organization is sectarian, and apparently it says so in the manifesto. And this is the sentence they usually quote: "The communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. They have no interests separate and apart from those of the proletariat as a whole." This puzzled me, that quote, and I actually looked up the German version, which I should have done a long time ago. And the German version is quite different, as it turns out. And I've put them underneath each other. And that really puzzled me. It really puzzled me how you can have a translation authorized by Frederick Engels in 1888, which is quite different from a later translation by Karl, which is actually the correct translation. Because I'm German, I can see that is the correct translation. So according to which the communists are not a special party vis-a-vis the other workers' parties, which is very different to the communists do not form a separate party opposed to the other working class parties. Now, this is it's more than just a sort of academic difference, and we're very happy to have with us Lawrence Parker, Marxist historian, who has done some work not just on this quote, but looked at the evolution of the Communist Manifesto. And just before he starts, Rob mentioned it already. I think this is the wrong way around, isn't it? But this book is really interesting, The Adventures of the Communist Manifesto by Hal Draper, and I do encourage comrades to read it because it goes into some details of how meanings have changed, etc., etc. So, Lawrence, over to you.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Tina. Good evening, everybody, and thank you to Tina for inviting me to speak, actually, and thank you to Rob, who gave a very kind of useful overview of lots of things in the Communist Manifesto. I'm not going to cover the same that as Tina has alluded to, so hopefully this next 20 minutes or so is about, again, as Tina's introduced very well, slaying something of a sacred cow that appears in the 1888 authorized English translation of the actually what is called the Manifesto of the Communist Party. That is its actual title, which is important to remember. Communist Manifestos is a bit of a bastardized kind of a rendering of that. But the 1888 authorized English translation, or the AET, as Hal Draper calls it, was actually, it was done by a guy called Samuel Moore, and it was actually overseen by Engels. So, we have to take this kind of document seriously. It wasn't just something that was just slung out by a subsequent organization in a kind of hurry. This is why it's called the authorized. So Tina's already talked about the controversial quote or controversial line that I'm going to talk about, and that is, as Tina said, the communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class parties, and you can find this in the you can find this into the manifesto under the section title that I've actually forgot. But anyway, so this was, as I say, this came out in 1888, and again, as Tina has said quite rightly, a lot has been made of this kind of little sentence. Just this is anecdotal, right? When I was a kid, and when I was beginning of section 2, thank you, Tina. Yeah, sorry. When I was a kid and when I was starting to sell kind of, I can't remember what it was, living Marxism or whatever it was, Next Step or whatever journal it was on Oxford Cornmarket Street, you occasionally used to stand out there, and occasionally there was a kind of small Labour briefing group in Oxford, I think, or some kind of grouping that was in the Labour Party, kind of like, and they would always come up to you when you were selling on Cornmarket Street and quote this very kind of sentence back at you. So I came across it quite early, but I was a somewhat kind of arrogant pain in the ass kid, and I probably didn't take any much notice of that type of thing anyway, because I probably thought I knew better than them anyway. But it was something that you came across when you were in organizations that had Communist Party in the title. And so I became aware very quickly, to the extent, I think, which I went out and actually bought the Communist Manifesto, the one with the famous introduction by E.H. Karl, the historian, I think it was. And I did try, not that I got much enlightenment out of that introduction, or in particular about looking up that sentence in the translation. But as I say, a lot has been made of this very little sentence. And in the particular, though, we have to trace this kind of back, really, and say why this keeps recurring, why this argument keeps recurring. I'm going to have to cut short some of this outline, but it's basically that it comes from the Labour Party. The Labour Party, throughout its history, has actively drawn on this sentence, this phrase, about the communists do not form a separate party. And it's always used it in isolation from other elements of the manifesto and its circumstances of its production. The Labour Party's done that to defend itself against any kind of potential kind of incursions by communists and people to its left, and to defend its existence as a consistent supporter of capitalism and British imperialism. That's basically what has kind of happened in a very kind of nutshell way, a very simplified kind of way. Its usage actually began, it was actually Keir Hardie, who actually was of no, who wasn't particularly interested, obviously, in forming a communist organization, but its usage began with him, and you can find that in his writings. But actually, the person who probably in the Labour Party's history made the most of using this sentence was the Communist Labour Party's intellectual Harold Lasky, who was around in the 1930s and 40s. Oh, he's around earlier than that as well, obviously. But yeah, and he made use of the communists do not form a separate party sentence. He used that no less than 9 times in his introduction to the Labour Party's 1948 edition of the Manifesto of the Communist Party. They called it something else. They called it a socialist kind of landmark. And what this project was that Lasky was involved in 1948 was essentially the Labour Party trying to lay hold of the Communist Manifesto as a kind of means by which to undermine the Communist Party of Great Britain, which back in 1948 was still a substantial organisation. And the particular thing that actually riled Attlee and the Labour Party leadership was that the communists had quite a big influence on their left wing in Parliament, and particularly on international kind of matters. Comrades will know Ziliakis, who's the most famous kind of communist fellow traveller. But there was a whole heap, there was quite a big group who were prone to communist influence. And the Communist Party, although it was a political pygmy compared to the Labour Party, it did exercise influence in some parts of the trade union movement, and it wasn't something to be discounted. And the Labour Party actually put a lot of effort into undermining it ideologically. There's a whole stream of pamphlets about the Communist Party's behaviour during the Second World War, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But that was the reasoning behind it. And that's why they're trying to undermine the Communist Party. And the Communist Party in 1948 in Great Britain also had its own kind of, it wanted to have its own celebration of the 100th year anniversary of the Communist Manifesto, and it announced a wide stream of events. There was local areas of the CPGB produced pamphlets. There was big meetings about it. It was a big thing for the Communist Party at that point. It was their manifesto that they were laying claim hold to. And the Labour Party's enterprise, which was agreed to by Attlee and the Labour Party leadership, Lasky proposed it to them. This was all about pissing on communist chips in 1948. And it was also bound up with the Cold War and all them types of things, which I don't have time to go into. But basically, Lasky repeats this line: the communists do not form a separate party, and it's used as a tool to undermine separate organisation and to big up the kind of Labour Party and big up its kind of action and big up its role in creating the welfare state, which Lasky said that was kind of part of the prospectus of the Communist Manifesto, etc., etc., etc. So that's where this comes from and why it is actually so prevalent. And it's quite sad, really, to hear comrades far to the left of all that type of kind of politics kind of repeat this kind of line ad infinitum down the years. However, the context of the manifesto's production, it just undermines the ideas that the Labour Party spread about it. Its title, as we've said, was actually the Manifesto of the Communist Party, which even the Labour Party in its 1948 edition couldn't avoid referring to on one of its title pages, Manifesto of the Communist Party. Very odd document then to say communists do not form a separate party. Neither was the manifesto the product of Marx and Engels as individuals, as has been alluded to previously tonight. It was the product of a very specific organization, notably the Communist League, which offered, the Communist League had actually commissioned Marx to write this, Marx and Engels to write this document, but I think it was Marx who was mostly doing the drafting. And the Communist League actually got extremely irritated at the time that Marx took over this. And there was, you know, they basically gave him a load of letters saying, "Oh, you get on with it," kind of thing. So that is, so it's the product of the Communist League. Now, the Communist League wasn't as Soviet scholars subsequently try to portray it, although I have to say the Soviet scholars are generally much better than Labour Party scholars, mostly because they had all the documents in Moscow. So whatever, you know, the books that the Soviet scholars did produce are of interest and still relevant, and you can still go back to them today and see interesting things in them and very good, you know, good scholarship in them. But their problem was that they were always trying to do the opposite to the Labour Party and hammer the Communist League into the type of, try and portray it as a kind of over-centralized, militarized kind of organization. Obviously, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had become by the time these Soviet scholars were writing about it. But nevertheless, even though the Communist League wasn't like the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in any way, it was the product of a specific, particular communist organization that existed in space and time. It wasn't a nothing. They organized themselves in some ways. Monty Johnson, the CPGB scholar who wrote very interestingly on this and is well worth reading on this, as well as Draper, he kind of said that the Communist League was more like a kind of proto kind of party. And I think that's a reasonable kind of way of putting it. But all of this rather militates against the idea that that there's this timeless principle that communists never form a separate organization, because you can. It's just not true. It's just not true. It's not pertinent to the circumstances of, you know, how the manifesto actually came about. So moving rapidly on, Draper, as we've said, takes issue with the specific sentence of the manifesto that Lasky, Keir Hardie, and so many others on the left have made such a big meal out of. The communists do not form a separate party opposed to other working class party. As Tina's talked about, Draper retranslates this sentence from the 1848 German edition of the manifesto, and he translates this into the much softer formulation. The communists are not a special party vis-a-vis the other workers' parties. And what Draper argued about these translations, he argued that the English translation of 1888, the sentence, he said it makes 3 tactical errors in translation, conveying a plainly misleading idea to most readers. Because as Draper says, for was it really true that the communists did not oppose other tendencies? Of course they did oppose them. That is, they argued their opposing views, and the original does not really aim to deny this. And Rob's already given you the kind of synopsis of, like, of course, like Marx and Engels were arguing against other working class socialists in the manifesto. So this whole idea that, this whole idea that they don't, you're not separate, you don't oppose them, is not really on, really, in terms of the manifesto. But Draper also questioned why the English translation had changed the German original, "the communists are not," to "the communists do not form." Because Draper says, was it really true that the communists did not set up a separate organization? Why, they had just done so in establishing the Communist League, and exclamation mark there from Draper. And Draper goes on, the English translation sounds like a denial of this obvious fact, whereas the original was just making a statement about the non-sexist, non-sexist, non-sectist character of the special organisation just established. Similarly, on the issue of the special separate party, the words of the German original, so I'm not going to go into that because that's complicated German, which I'm going to get into trouble with this, so I'm going to avoid that. I'm going to avoid that trap. But I think this idea that actually that you know, the idea that the communists are not a special party, I mean, that's actually kind of true in that you know, communists may have a specific identity. They may be you know, they may be a particular part of the class, but they're not somehow beamed down from the planet kind of Zog to, you know, declaim to the working class masses. They're not special in that sense, unless you're a sadist, when obviously that could be the case. They could have beamed down from the planet Zog if you're of that persuasion. But communists aren't special in that kind of sense. There was a kind of an interesting line that Harry Pollitt, who was the old general secretary of the CPGB, who I'm not generally a fan of, but he said something very interesting once to his comrades about, you know, we must get away from this idea that communists are somehow set apart from the rest of humanity, and that they don't have dreams, that they don't have lovers, and they don't enjoy poetry, and they don't enjoy good food, etc., etc., etc. And in that sense, you know, communists live and breathe as every other kind of working class kind of person. There's not something special in that kind of sense. They just have a particular political kind of stance. And so, you know, we have to be careful about what these kind of ideas kind of lead to. But basically, the main kind of thing as far as Engels is concerned, because we must be very careful talking about Engels' kind of role in the 1888 translation. You know, I think we have to be a little bit careful of, because Draper says quite boldly that this is a mistranslation. I don't think that Frederick Engels would have seen it as any such thing, actually. I think Engels would have seen it as a product of the 1848 manifesto, and the fact that they did not want to be seen to be sectarian towards the Chartists. The Communist League in the UK, Harney and Ernest Jones, they were on the left wing of the Chartist movement. To some extent, Chartism was their organisation. An organisation that one wing was armed, organised for the militant prosecution of working class kind of politics. To some extent, they saw it as their party, and the Communist Manifesto is it does not want to be seen as a sectarian, because if you had an organisation like the Chartists, if that organisation was transposed into the UK now, I personally wouldn't be too kind of hung up on being in a separate organisation if that type of thing that was going on. However, it's worthwhile remembering that, you know, the Communist League, although it broke up not long after this, people were still, you know, you know, Harney and Jones maintained their membership of the Communist kind of League. So, that is really why I think when Engels would have been looking back to 1848 and looking at the Communist Manifesto, I don't think he would have seen it as a mistranslation. I just think he would have seen it as a product of the contingent circumstances of the time. What Engels or Marx were not trying to do with the Communist Manifesto, they weren't laying down like a timeless recipe of principles for people to start arguing about, you know, hundreds of years later. I don't think the manifesto of the Communist Party was a programmatic document that was contingent in its time. They wouldn't. That to me is the method of kind of bourgeois kind of scholars, is just to take the Communist Manifesto or the Introduction to the Critique of Political Economy and use that in isolation. And just to say, well, that's Marxism then. That you know, the Communist Manifesto doesn't exhaust Marxism, and it should be used in a very kind of particular type of way. Also, as well, Engels just to make this doubly clear that Engels wasn't an advocate of this idea of communists do not form a separate party in all circumstances. Engels actually supported a split of the what he called the irreconcilable leftists in the French Workers' Party in 1882, and he actually applauded them leaving the people who'd sold out and who were going to the right. And Engels actually applauds them. You can read this in the collected writings of Engels' collected writings. He actually applauded the leftists being in a minority with the correct program. So clearly, different kind of circumstances created a different thing. The French Socialist Party as a whole wasn't to be treated as something akin to the kind of Chartists. This is the last point now. You'll be glad to know that I'm going to wind this up. But if you want an idea of what happens to people who get involved in the Labour Party without a specific socialist or communist organisation, the type of people that would tend to be inclined to make use of that sentence, the communists do not form a separate party, I would just say, look around you at the Labour left, which, I was in the Labour Party until quite recently, but the history of the left of the Labour Party, and to some extent the trade union movement, it's full of individuals, networks and journals who continually move to the right. Because they don't have the political anchor, they don't have the political discipline that you need from a specific socialist or communist organisation. And it's not that such people, they don't start out corrupt. It's not anything to do with their morality in particular, although obviously there are some individuals who join who do have a bad kind of morality. Most of these people start out like we all started out, like they wanted to change the world. But the trouble is, if you go into these organizations and you say, well, Communist Manifesto tells me I don't have to have a separate socialist organization, so I can just go in the Labour Party and be a socialist. But the evidence of like history and the reason why we see people continually backsliding, continually going to the right, continually falling prey to all sorts of bourgeois ideas and kind of influence, it's because that they don't have that sheet anchor of having like a specific socialist or communist organization. And, that is the kind of point to make. And so to me, this is the kind of salient lesson of why the idea that Marx and Engels were somehow against us forming our own specific organizations as socialists. It's not just a textual kind of historical, interpretive kind of issue. Useful though that can be sometimes. It's probably what, I lose myself at my own backside over that type of thing. But actually, this is actually an idea that's actually positively harmful if you're kind of serious about your communist future. And so that's why I would hardly, but as I say, don't take my word for it on any of this stuff. Read the relevant literature, read Draper, read Ryazanov, who's the kind of Soviet scholar who also wrote very kind of pungently on this, and read the people who argue in favor, read Lasky and read Keir Hardie, and make up your own mind. But my mind is pretty made up on this, and I think that you can't defend this argument that communists do not form a separate organisation. It doesn't make sense in the context of the manifesto or the rest of kind of Marx and Engels' kind of political kind of career. That's it.
Thank you so much. I agree with you. That's why we invited you on there, because that sentence did make no sense to me at all when I reread it. Even like the sentence afterwards and the next paragraphs quite clearly state that the communists do this and this, as opposed to the other working class parties. And I think your explanation does make a lot of sense, that it had to do with the Chartists and not wanting to be seen as sectarian. There's also a couple of quotes I found, which is also in Draper again. This is a really good book where Engels later tried to explain what the Communist League was and the manifesto in relation to it, where he says, there was no Communist Party, that's true. The German Communist Party, as we called it, consisted only of a small core, the Communist League. In another article, he wrote that the League of the Just, which was another part of the Communist League, was the Communist Party in process of formation. So I think proto-party, the way you put it, is exactly right. It didn't exist at the time. They hoped that it would, and they worked towards it, and they did all through their life. They didn't just write. They also were involved in various attempts to form organizations of the left. I also think it's really important to say, and you and Rob did, it's not a timeless recipe. It doesn't work. Everything has to be taken with a pinch of salt, and 170 years later, etc. And we should do that with anything. Obviously, we're not dogmatists. Just because Marx and Engels wrote something doesn't mean it always has to be the truth and nothing but the truth. We've got a few comrades now who want to come in. Both Rob and Lawrence, if you want to reply to somebody, please put up your hand and I can put you in any time. First person up with the hand was Nick. Hi.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you both to Rob and to Lawrence for very enjoyable introductions. I think there's a great deal of material in both talks. Myself, I reread the manifesto this afternoon. I don't know how many times I've read it, but I was struck this afternoon at how inspirational it was, even reading it for God knows how many scores of times, and how much I got out of it. Clearly, it's a historical document, as Engels acknowledged in 1872 when he wrote the preface that Rob referred to. But in that document, and I think we have to remember that it's a document that will probably be the document which most people come to Marx and Engels' writings through. So however historical it is, we need to understand it and be able to explain it and engage with it. I think also, though, we have to be quite careful about liturgical exegesis, that I'm going to call it. I actually agree with what Lawrence said. I don't believe that Engels would have agreed to a translation that he didn't agree with or thought was wrong. And in a way, it shows that when we're trying to explain Marx and Engels' ideas, which essentially is about changing society, it's about getting rid of private ownership. That's what the manifesto is about. It's about getting rid of bourgeois property, private property, the ownership of the means of production. It's about emancipating the working class from wage labor, from wage slavery, and therefore through that, eventually, the whole of humanity. If we go into what the Communist Manifesto is talking about in broad sweep. But just on this question of the party or not, my own opinion is that if somebody's trying to be a clever clogs, well, you can engage with them, or you can actually try to engage with people on the present reality. And the present reality is that it was very difficult and now probably impossible for communists, Marxists, to make serious headway inside the Labour Party. And we have to find a way of expressing or proselytizing or educating others about what Marx and Engels argued, which is still relevant today. And so we have to do those in terms of modern society. And in modern society, the way that we prosecute our ideas, we need a party, we need an organization, we need party literature, radio, TV, websites, etc. And we need to do that. And I would also go further, because somebody asked a question, what is the Labour Party? I think we need our own party. And certainly, we can't suck that out of our thumb. But we also have to appreciate that most working class people in Britain at the moment still look to the Labour Party. So there is a political battle to be waged against the leaders of the Labour Party just as Marx and Engels, as Rob explained, waged an intellectual argument against the different types of socialism and communism that existed at the time that the manifesto was written. And of course, it didn't stop there, because Marx and Engels also had to compete and destroy Proudhonism and then Lassalleanism, Bismarckian socialism, and so on. And in many ways, there's nothing really new that we come across. The arguments that we meet of the left reformists and the right bourgeois leaders like Starmer, they're arguments that have been met before, and the arguments are there. And we just have to bring the arguments up to date with what's actually happening now, and why these people actually run a million miles from the arguments that Marx put in the Communist Manifesto. And that is essentially, we need a movement. The proletariat, the working class, has to organize itself into a party and into a movement which challenges the exploitation of labor through wage labor, the creation of commodity production for profit, and we need to get rid of that. And if you go through the different parts of the manifesto, it's there, bold. And I mean, today I've sort of underlined previous underlinings and highlighted previous notes and so on, but it's the sweep of the history, the materialist, the historical materialist conception of history, which is set out briefly in the manifesto. It's wonderful to read. But if you absorb that in terms of the development of different stages of society, and you then look at the proletariat and you compare what Marx was describing in 1848 and 175, because it's 175 this February when it was published, probably the last week of February 1848. What has happened? In fact, the bourgeois mode of production, the concentration of capital, the increase in factories, techniques, science, technology, the integration of the world economy, the integration of the world proletariat, all of this has made even greater the possibility of transforming society than when Marx published the manifesto all those years ago. So in brief, in those few pages, you have the outline of Marxist ideas, which of course they went on to write about elsewhere. I think one important point that I just want to make before we leave, in the 1872 preface, in addition to saying that those demands, they don't, hold fast to them, they need to be updated and so on, there was an extremely important change which Marx and Engels introduced to the manifesto, and that was the lessons of the Paris Commune, where they said that the lesson of the Commune was that the working class could not simply take hold of the ready-made bourgeois capitalist state machine. They had to destroy that state machine and create their own state, which in time would wither away and disappear along with classes, along with exploitation, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Also interesting when they're talking about the evolution of from one society to the next. It's the old is within the new already, or the other way around. The new is within the old. That we have the socialist features within capitalism that give a glimpse of what is possible, which you sort of see during COVID a little bit. Where suddenly they found the magic money tree. Ah, there it is. Kevin, please.
Thanks, comrades. Thanks to the two comrades who introduced the session. Nick has taken some of the points that I wanted to raise, but I will just develop on a little from them, in that the Communist Manifesto is a very inspirational document, and actually it reads very well as a piece of literature. For my sins in the middle 1970s, was actually examined for part of my degree on this document. So it was a set text in my degree. And I remember coming out of the exam room and my fellow students saying, God, that was a really hard question on the Communist Manifesto. And the difficulty they had was that they had formed a particular view of the Communist Manifesto, largely from A.J.P. Taylor's introduction, not E.H. Karl's or Gareth Stedman Jones, which was to really sort of turn it into a sort of rigid, quite Soviet-style document. And what I think the document did, and again, bearing in mind the historical context, was it did really point towards the future at a time when very few other people could see beyond both the immediate and indeed the past, because a lot of the socialist tendencies that Marx and Engels are attacking are actually quite backward looking. And it's the idea, I suppose, of what you might call the music of the future, that as Tina says, within the existing society, within the developing social formations, within the developing economy, is the potential for the future. Now that's clearly Hegelian, and I think, again, the way that if you read this document without some understanding of the type of philosophical background, the ideas of the contradictions and the immanence within the document can sometimes be lost. But it's, I suppose, a critique if you think of some of the original drafts pre the Communist Manifesto, particularly one that Engels got together called Principles of Communism, which were very much in a sort of catechism form. For those of us who were reared as Catholics would be very familiar with that type of form. And what I think is interesting is that the Communist Manifesto doesn't present the future society as some sort of utopian aspiration, some sort of model. It's the idea that the forces that will create that society, both in terms of the way that capitalism is developing and will become more and more socialized, which of course is developed in later prefaces and so on, but also the social force, the proletariat that will carry out the revolution, but above all will deal with the problem that Hegel and indeed other radicals, well, Hegel wasn't particularly a radical, but the young Hegelians had developed on this idea of, the relationship between the individual and society. The universal class would not be the state, it would not be some other class, it would be the proletariat. And that, I think, is the important point within the manifesto, that it looks towards the proletariat. In other words, a universal class that can carry out human emancipation. And the writings of Marx, well, particularly Marx, Engels, I think less so, are really sort of, struggling to put that into a political form. But in the manifesto, they certainly do that. And that, that to me is its importance. Tina talks about its historical sweep. And again, the idea of the history of all hitherto existing societies as being one of class struggle. And then the point about the different class struggles, but also the achievements of previous societies and indeed the achievements of capitalism, which point towards the future. And I think it's the future-facing orientation, I think, is important there. The idea of a new society, the potential that capitalism gives us, to develop that society. And I think on the left, that has been somewhat neglected, partly because of we're in a period of quite severe capitalist crisis. We're in a period now of wars, ecological crisis, and so forth. But it's actually the sort of sense of human potential and the potential of the proletariat, which I think really comes across there. I'd like to refer to some of the stuff that Lawrence said, which I think was very good. Yes, I will wind. Sorry, Tina. I think was a very, interesting discussion, particularly on the way that the manifesto is used and everybody tries to appropriate it. I think earlier today there was a certain discussion in which we looked at the meaning of the word besonder or besonderes, and I think it's interesting that in Marx's writing, it's not a studied ambiguity. It's not playing with words. I think there is a dialectic element in it. There's there's an idea of contradiction. And I think the difference between special and particular is, I think, very significant. And the way that I've seen it translated and discussed, and bear in mind that 19th century German, like 19th and 20th century English, are very different. Is that you're talking about something that is distinct. In other words, it's not an amorphous grouping, but it is actually part of the grouping. So it's both within the working class, it's both within the working class movement, but it's on a different level. So that the term Besonders is both special, in other words, it's distinctive and it's different. It's not like the common, it's particular, but it's not separate. And I think that bearing in mind the philosophical training of many of the people who were writing this, we would need to look at that. Now, that's, as Lawrence said, is not just a sort of a discussion on words, because of course we would need to interpret these words and these ideas in a modern context. But it does mean that if we're going to start logic chopping, or we're starting with textual work, let's really get back to the contradictions and indeed the richness of the text, which a lot of people have simplified, I think, for their own particular purposes. Anyway, my apologies for going on too long.
It's all right. It was interesting, so don't worry about it. There are difficulties with translating the German into the English, and there are phrases, Bürger, they transfer into bourgeois, but it also meant civilians or civil society. So there's all sorts of different difficulties that they faced in translating it. It's also worthwhile knowing or remembering that I think Draper works out that Engels worked on the translation for 1 week only. He only had 1 week while he was doing other stuff as well. And he was hoping that Laura Marx would rework it and bring out the next edition. That never happened. So this one became it was authorized by Engels, no doubt about it, but he hoped the next edition would be better and would be reworked by Laura Marx. John Holliday now, please.
Yes, thanks, Tina, and thanks to both speakers and the contributions so far. I'm not going to say a great deal about the points that Lawrence Parker was making, because I think they apply to all Marx's writings, really. You have to be very careful about what you're reading because of the translation, because of the difficulties of going from one language into another. Also, the difficulties of the context in which they're writing these texts. Censorship, etc. They're not exactly writing in free societies where everything is open to discussion. So they have to be quite careful at times about the language they use. And also, what strikes me is, I think what Kevin was referring to, is the philosophical background's got to be taken into account, but also the way the texts are being used by political organizations since then, the emphasis that's given to different terms. And also the fact that these are historical texts, and they shouldn't be treated as tablets of stone. It's quite possible, I'm not saying in this context that Marx and Engels altered their ideas, but it is, that I know they developed, as everybody does, develops their ideas according to the situation, according to latest research. I don't want to go on too much about that, and I'll try and be brief. What I want to get down to is some of the content, which I think Rob was referring to in the text, the actual ideas expressed in the Communist Manifesto. I'll just concentrate on one, really. One thing that one particular sentence I think is very relevant today. He talks about the organization of the proletariat or the working class into a class and into a political party is constantly being disrupted by competition between workers. Now, that strikes to me as particularly relevant and something that has developed since Marx's days, that we take in adequate account of, that we are talking about a working class that develops with capitalism or capital, and in which the working class has not identified itself as a class for itself, for its own emancipation, for its abolition of wage labour, but remains a class for capital. It's in the context of a capitalist situation, and a lot of the working class identify with particular employers, with the particular organisation of the work as it exists now, factories, or etc. And that is something that's obviously encouraged by capitalists themselves, to constantly divide the workers. So there's that basis on a class for capital, but it's also the case that the workers are divided amongst themselves, and the capitalists will encourage that. You can see it in the current debate about levelling up the North from the South. Should you identify with basically the capitalists of the North, the Northern powerhouse, trying to get the workers to identify with one particular faction of capital as against another? And that is a process that's constantly going on. Why I think it's relevant today, and what does concern me, is the passages at the end of the Communist Manifesto, which are basically about the nation state, you know, and the identification, the workers have no country, that the workers are international, and that should be the perspective. Workers of the world unite, that revolutionary slogan that's so particularly important and becomes increasingly important, and you can see it played out today. Workers constantly identifying with their particular nation state, and that waving of flags, getting behind this particular ruling class, getting behind that particular ruling class, which has a devastating effect or impact on the class struggle in itself, that the workers identify with a particular ruling class and therefore compete with the others. Now, obviously, that has a context we're facing now with the situation in Ukraine between Russia and that. But it's something that's constantly developing in our modern world, that the working class has not developed an independent voice and tends to identify with its own ruling class and gets pulled behind the interests of the ruling class, and are constantly being used by that ruling class to maintain their own order, but also to conduct conflicts with other capitalists, with particularly in this context with competitive capitalists within the nation state. So I just want to emphasize that point. I think it's a point that's not been emphasized enough when we're looking at the Communist Manifesto, that internationalist perspective that is present throughout the Communist Manifesto, and of course is very relevant today.
As it was in the run-up to the First World War, of course, which split the Second International, when suddenly, you know, there were all these declarations were internationalists, and then boom, everybody supported their own bourgeoisie. Quite right, John. Steve Freeman now, please.
There we go. Sorry. Thank you. I unmute myself. I'm already unmuted, I think it says here. Sorry, comrades. Well, first of all, to thank Rob and Lawrence for their presentations, the really interesting introductions, and to the contributions of other comrades. And I, like Nick, also was doing a bit of a rapid rereading, because the Communist Manifesto was one of the first things that I read decades ago that made me think about communism. I remember finding it very interesting, the idea that capitalism was kind of revolutionary, which is how he speaks in the first part of it, the revolutionary character of capitalism in transforming the world. And I thought that was a kind of interesting point. But I never really read the prefaces. So today I was looking at the prefaces, you know, and there's some kind of interesting material in there. So that was a bit I'd missed out. But I want to approach it more not from the question of the party question, but from the program question. Now, I think last week the battle lines were drawn or redrawn thanks to the contribution of Luke Pickrell, and it's interesting. I find some of that in one of the prefaces between what I would call Republican communism and anarcho-communism. So I thought, as I was reading it today, let's find out if there's any Republicanism in the Communist Manifesto and if there's any evidence of anarcho-communism in it. Well, as you look through it, it certainly is. I was reminded, the difference, of course, is that the Republican communists believe we need a democratic republic to proceed towards communism. They need to get rid of the existing state. That's the key thing. Whereas anarcho-communism would either blow it up or just ignore it. And of course, I then noted that the 1882 first Russian edition of the Communist Manifesto was translated by Bakunin, of all people. Bakunin, of course, was an anarchist, and anarchists in those days considered themselves to be communists, just a different type of communist. And so when you then look towards the bit on critical utopian socialism and communism, page 71, he starts to talk about Saint-Simon, Fourier and Owen, all examples of what I would call anarcho-communism, utopian communism. And Marx and the manifesto says they are violently opposed to all political action on the part of the working class. Such action, according to them, can only result from blind unbelief in the new gospel of anarcho-communist utopia. And he then goes on to say the Owenites in England and the Fourierists in France respectively oppose the Chartists, and they oppose what he calls the reformists, followers of the paper called Reform. And what's the thing about the Chartists and these the people following Reform is that they are doing political struggle. And Marx was sympathetic to the idea that the working class must struggle for democratic and political reform. And of course, it says, if you actually read the footnote, which I did at page 31, the reform people in France between 1843 who advocated the establishment of a republic and carrying out democratic and social reforms. But so we can find that trend. However, I thought, well, there's not the word republic never appears in I couldn't see the word republic anywhere in the Communist Manifesto at all. It just doesn't seem to. It doesn't seem to come into it. And then I discovered on page 50, I found it, because it says on page 50, the immediate aim of the communists is the formation of the proletariat into a class, you could think party, a class, into a class, the overthrow of bourgeois supremacy, and the conquest of political power by the proletariat. Let's remember that the conquest of it's the number one thing to do is the conquest of political power. Do they mean in all countries simultaneously or in one country? So I'm thinking about this, thinking, well, what's the link there? So I thought, well, the link there is in the demands of the Communist Party in Germany, which I think Tina mentioned in 1848. So we can go to there. It starts, proletarians of all countries unite. And so what is the first demand of the Communist Party in Germany in 1848? It says simply, the whole of Germany shall be declared a united and indivisible republic. So when the Marx and Engels are thinking about politics and political power and how that power works, they are going back towards those questions. And then, of course, Nick then reminded me, thanks, Nick, that in the 1872 edition, or preface to the 1872 edition, Marx is therefore told, or Marx and Engels are talking about the Paris Commune, because it's in the Paris Commune, the fight for that republic in Paris in 1870-71, of course, that's the bit that's kind of missing out of the Communist Manifesto. But even when you read, and I'll finish on this point, even when you read the manifesto's 10-point plan, which begins the abolition of property and land, a heavy progressive graduated income tax, the abolition of the right inheritance, the getting of all the banks into a single bank, etc. All those demands, there is no political or democratic demands there at all. But then that kind of makes sense if they're not talking about any particular country. They're just talking generally about things. And if they start to talk about the different political countries and how political power is configured in different countries, then they come back to the political and democratic questions, which I believe is there. So I'll finish on that point.
Thank you, Steve. Anne.
Oh, Steve, I probably agree with you on some points, but you just seem to make the same contribution every time. Mm. Anyway, moving on. Now, okay, so this is my view on it. I think that there's no point in trying to match today's conditions to Marx's and Engels formulations for, or sorry, their demands, the demands of the Communist Manifesto, it would be ludicrous, really, wouldn't it? Because we're in a very different situation, and it was a living document. But what I do think is important, and that's why I think it is important to look at the text, is to look at their methodology and also to look at the context, because I actually have found Communist Manifesto at times quite difficult to get my head around. And maybe that's for the reasons that Kevin said, but sometimes I think that that translation, it's quite contradictory, or appears contradictory. So I think it was John Holiday talked about it being internationalist, but then yet we have in it, the working class must become the nation. I'm paraphrasing, but it's something like that. And I've always thought, well, what does it mean like that? That, you know, there's something progressive about nationalism. So I suppose that that's something also that I found to be a problem. And obviously this question itself, which I agree, is a mistranslation from what comrades have said. It sounds like when you even look at that particular sentence, and then you look further down the same page, you can see it doesn't match, because they're talking about communists, besides deigning to hide their views, they're talking about them, how they organize themselves in relation to the other forces of society. So they're saying that they're organizing themselves, but what they are also saying, of course, is that they don't go off and form a special group that sets itself up as the kind of authority on everything and separates itself off from the class. And obviously, like, this is a much later period, but I would be a bit familiar with the situation in the 1880s with the strikes and demonstrations and the role of the STF at that time, which was very sectarian and which Engels was, withering about. But so I think that was always a battle they were fighting, to make sure that these kind of plans, these what you call them, like the kinds of blueprints, that these blueprints weren't enforced by groups. And I think that was also because of the time that they were living in, when there were many of those kind of organizations that they were arguing with, the utopian socialists, etc. But I think that it is important to know the context. And just one final thing, because I'm by no means a professional translator, but I did learn Russian in order to translate the journal of the Women's Department of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And along the way, like I've seen quotes, I've read quotes, translated quotes from the journal, and then I went and read the journal myself, and I saw that they were wrong. Now that could be perhaps you could say a style, but also it often is politics. So I think that that's something that, maybe Helen MacFarland, who apparently disappeared after 1850 and then later married a preacher and had all sorts of strange things happen in her life, perhaps she didn't really particularly understand. And then you've given the reasons why Engels wasn't actually paying close attention to it, or had hoped that it would be rectified. But I think that it does raise the issue of whether a new translation of the Communist Manifesto is necessary, with an introduction to it, a new introduction, and that deals with some of the context in which the team were operating at the time. You could say perhaps Hal Draper has done that work already, but it seems that given the fact that for instance, that the translation on Marxist.org is the original one, that anybody who's searching on the internet is going to come across that. And I think it does, although you look down the page, then you say, well, no, that's contradiction. At the same time, it does stand out, Anyway, so excellent presentations, and thank you, in particular, Lawrence, because I thought that was very clear argumentation to show the problem with the current translation. Thanks.
Rob and Lawrence both want to come in briefly. We do try to finish by 9 though, remember. Okay, Rob first, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to kind of come back on what Steve said there and something of what Anne said. I think if you go into Manifesto with an intention of finding something, you can find it. It is that kind of document. It is short. It deals in broad strokes. So I think, you know, I think in a way that's a kind of a flawed way to approach Manifesto. I think what I tried to do in my presentation was to look at Manifesto and kind of approach it, trying to be as kind of open-minded to what the text itself is saying as possible. And I would say that there are notions of definitely a unification of democratic movements in Manifesto. There is a quote. I don't have it to hand. It is in my preparatory notes. I was just trying to draft through it, and then my camera did what it did. There is some allusion to Republican communism in there if you're looking for it, and there is allusion to anarcho-communism in there if you're looking for it. So I would say that method of approaching this text is flawed in a sense. And in regards to Anne, I think there's, you know, applying the revolutionary context of applying the revolutionary content of Manifesto to modern society to be ludicrous. I found that quite problematic because I think, as I show in the mode of production, really is the same in a broad in a broad way. You know, we still have, you know, and Capital, reading Capital definitely shows that, you know, we still have the same relation of labour and capital, although it is transformed. That relationship is continuously transformed, but the fundamentals of the relationship remain the same. And with that in mind, you can look at that the revolutionary context as being similar in a way. And I think, you know, if you look at the way that the global economy is going, we are returning to a kind of pre-revolutionary world at the moment. You know, the increase of the 1%, the income share of the 1%, I think demonstrates that you know, now that the kind of spectre of communism appears to be defeated, capitalist class are using that opportunity to again increase exploitation and expropriation. And it's also worth remembering that in the industrial world, in the global south and in developing nations, the relationship is still very stark, and the contrast is still very stark, and the working conditions are still the same as those 19th century working conditions. So it's worth looking at in that kind of context as well. I wouldn't say it's ludicrous, but I'd say it does have to be transformed, but it's not out with the realms of possibility. So I would say.
Lawrence. Yeah,
there were some interesting kind of points in that. Just a couple that I'll pick up on. The first one was like Kevin's point about like dialectical kind of transitions, and I particularly wanted to apply that to like party, because when somebody says to you party, as in left-wing party, you kind of think, well, you kind of have that image either of a kind of Trotskyist or other type of sect, or you have that image of i.e. a party of just a few people who've decided themselves that they are a party, or you have that kind of image of like Brezhnev looking down from like the Moscow Mausoleum at a long demonstration of tanks. There's that. So it's become a kind of scary kind of world. But party means part. It means part of the class. It's you're a party, but it's quite correct that when we're looking at them kind of words that are being used, there's a dialectic involved in it. That the impression I get from the Communist Manifesto and from other kind of things is that the party is the same as it's not special, it's not weird or being down in a kind of utopian kind of way to help out. It's none of those kinds of things. But it's the same. It's the same, but it's also different. And that's the kind of thing. And sometimes people, that dialectical kind of logic that obviously Marx took on from kind of Hegel, which I'm probably explaining very badly, that idea that something can be one thing and another at the same time. We kind of need to get hold of that idea, I think, in relation to this, because the party is the same, but it's different, because if it's not the same as the working class, if it's not composed of working class people, then it turns into its kind of opposite. And I think, but that happens constantly in kind of life. You constantly come across things that are the same but different. I'm trying to think of an example. Well, I suppose like me and Tina spent many years in the same organization. And if you got me and Tina talking in a pub and somebody came along, they'd probably be able to tell that we've got certain similarities. But obviously me and Tina have got all sorts of differences over all sorts of things, and we're kind of very different in the way we kind of approach things. But in some senses, we're the same. We went for the same education and the same kind of thing. And that idea kind of concurs. And I think it's a very important, part of the transition. This relates onto the Communist kind of manifesto as a whole. We are transformed. It's looking towards the communist future, but it's looking at the seeds of those things within capitalism. So, it takes on some of the things of capitalism, but it also transforms them into something else. It's again, where there's a similarities, but there's also kind of differences. And I think those transitions carry on for the whole document. So I just saw a comment that said that this is, aren't we getting, into kind of minor points? I don't think we're getting into minor points at all. This is the kind of method of the document that we're trying to lay out and understand. Nick said about, I agreed with Nick on what he said, is we still need to fight against the Labour Party. I think that's kind of right. And I think that's going to become ever more apparent. I think all I was really arguing on that was that you can't really do that as individuals by just lolloping into the Labour Party on your own or with a little network, really. But I agreed with what Nick his emphasis on that point. I got something wrong in my introduction that Kevin picked me up on. It wasn't E.H. Karl who introduced the Communist Manifesto. It was also A.J.P. Taylor, which I should have remembered that because he's one of my, despite him being a right-wing kind of historian, he is actually one of my favourite kind of right-wing historians, if that makes sense. The last thing I'll just talk about is literature. Like, I agree that the Communist Manifesto is like a great kind of form of literature. And again, too often, I think those kind of things are like down the kind of literary art of like the kind of writers who write these types of things, in particular, like Marx and Engels, and all sorts of other writers. Often the kind of aesthetics of that writing is kind of downplayed, and it's seen as, on the left, those things are seen as secondary kind of skills. But there's a reason why the Communist Manifesto, carries on drawing people in and selling kind of millions. It's because it's beautifully written and it's a beautiful piece of literature. And, I've known many people who are not Marxists who've found it to be a very wonderful, inspiring kind of piece of literature. And we've got that in the traditions of the movement. We've got William Morris, and there's all sorts of other kind of, we've also had lots of other great writers. Trotsky would be the obvious kind of example. People who know how to write beautifully, people who know how to turn a phrase. I think those kind of skills, they need to kind of be relearned. Too often the left just turns people into robotic kind of empirical kind of journalists who are just there to, I don't know, report on facts. That's not how I was brought up. And I find the Communist Manifesto very inspirational on that. I've got to go soon. So thanks, everybody, and go with Christ.
Thank you, Lawrence. Also, you were not referring to anybody in the audience when you were just talking about journalists, were you?
No. Well, I'm for my sins. I guess I'm a journalist as well, but I escaped that by being a sub-editor. So.
Yep. I know the feeling. We got 3 more contributions from the floor. Brian first. His camera doesn't work, so if you could just speak now, please.
Hi, Tina.
Look, what's the most important thing at the moment? The cost of living crisis is making people desperate, and it's beginning to force people to look for alternatives. Okay, little by little, they're realizing they can't live in the old way. This is where the Communist Manifesto comes in. The last speaker spoke about it being inspirational. It is. It creates a view of the future that didn't exist prior to the moment it was written, which exists to this day, has become a lot more relevant. So for me, that's the most important thing in terms of certain aspects of the Communist Manifesto that we can have internal discussions about, but we shouldn't confuse these internal discussions with the most important external connection between the Communist Manifesto and society today. And that's the way it should be used. It is inspirational. It does give workers, students, all those who are suffering the biggest attack on standards of living since the 1930s with a perspective of change. And I think that's how we should use it. I'm finished, Tina.
Thank you, Conrad. Luke, please.
Yeah, thanks. This is kind of a clarifying question, and I think it gets into maybe that passage that folks were kind of focusing on. You know, I think I had read this discussion around the party and independent party as in the context of 1848 and the 1848 revolutions. And I'm thinking now perhaps I have a kind of a superficial schematic kind of understanding. So I'm curious, you know, folks, presenters want to respond to this idea, but I had read that as well. Prior to 1848, there hadn't been this great understanding that the bourgeois parties no longer played a progressive role, that was like, you know, one of the prime understandings coming out of 1848 was, oh gosh, you know, now we've got to, you know, go in on this on our own. And so that in that sense, that represented that there was kind of that moment of realization after the document had been written, and that it represented a thought that folks had prior to then engaging in the revolutions and learning a lesson. And then that then will lead me to say, or to think sometimes of this kind of pithy little slogan of, oh, well, you know, the lessons of 1848 haven't been learned. So, you know, whenever socialists, however, support the Labor Party or they support the Democrats here in the United States, you know, they're not learning the lessons of 1848, which is that, you know, the bourgeoisie are no friend of democracy or no progressive democratic force. So just, I'm reevaluating that, but curious, you know, if what folks think about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. Paul Collins, please.
Hello. When I first read the manifesto, I was about 17, and at the time I couldn't see how it was relevant. But then about a decade later, I became a Rutland College student, and that was in 2008. And it turned out that that was a perfect time to go to Rutland College because it was during the economic, you know, the banking crash and whatever you want to call it. And you could actually see when I had a discussion with my economic tutor, and I told him what I thought of it in the induction week. When he asked me why it was I thought it was irrelevant, I realized that I couldn't answer. So he said, read it again. So I did. And while all that was going on, I could finally see why it was relevant and why it is still relevant today. But that is the only full text of Marx I have actually read. I've read bits of Marx from other texts, but it's a bit here, a bit there, and that sort of thing. I must admit, I do find the discussion about the translation absolutely fascinating. Did they mean this? Did they mean that? I like that discussion. I don't think my GCSE German would have helped, not at that level anyway. I think Rob made a good point about if you're looking for something, you can find it in there. I agree, that is flawed. It's a bit like when somebody takes a Bible verse or two without taking the context of the rest of the book in in the Bible. I put that in there for Nick because I know he likes that kind of thing. But I can't. Oh yeah, I thought it was quite good that John made a good point about the censorship. So maybe they, like he said, they did have to maybe reword certain things to get past the censor. I can't actually remember my other point, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, comrade. We just have one more person with their hand up, Will McMahon. Come on then, Will. You has to be made a panelist. Okay, if you could switch your camera on quickly, that would be great. If anybody else wants to come in, raise your hand now or forever hold your peace.
Okay,
Hi,
I'll be really, really quick. I mean, my thought about the manifesto, I hadn't read it for ages, actually. My thought about it was that it's at one and the same time a really historically situated piece that I don't really think you can probably get your head around unless you've looked at the history of what was going on around it. And at the same time, it was massively futuristic in some of what it was writing. So it kind of had both elements in it. It's quite backward in parts, because if you look at the discussion about it, Marx talks about the barbarian countries as opposed to the civilized countries. Assumes that it's the working class is male, so there's some stuff that you would want to go, well, maybe not that yet. But when it talks about the continually revolutionizing of the production, right? That paragraph where it talks about how revolutionary the bourgeoisie are is fantastic and amazing, and is completely today. If we think what we've been through in the last 30, 40 years, we've been through a revolution. They are still very revolutionary, actually. They've been revolutionizing everybody's lives through how they've changed stuff. So I think it's brilliant because it actually grabs hold of that. But it is as a document dealing with early capitalism, I think, early industrial capitalism. And so when it talks about what it's doing to workers, making them mere attachments of machine, again, today has some truth, a lot for some people. I mean, this bloody thing, yeah, lots of us are chained to this one. But also it doesn't quite get the sophistication of what's happened in terms of the proletariat and how it's been chopped, diced and sliced in this period, I think, that we're living in. There are some, and I know, Rob, we shouldn't pick, right? I know we shouldn't pick, but I can't resist the points that they make about, hey, well, if there were censors there, in there, Marx is calling for the violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie. Marx and Engels, it's in there in the manifesto, yeah? But the thing that really struck me was about the grave diggers, yeah, that capitalism is producing its own grave diggers, right? And there was an inevitabilism about it almost. Yeah, and there's been an argument about whether it's inevitable. I think we're past that now. And I think we know that socialism is not inevitable. Communism is not inevitable, actually, that you have to make it happen. And actually, given the environmental crisis and what capital has done to the globe, they might be our grave diggers over time. Capital might actually destroy the planet if they're not got rid of. And I think that puts us in a different position, future terms, about what we're thinking about. One other thing, just to be cheeky, from last week's conversation, there's a bit in it said the proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, comma, by degree, comma, all capital from the bourgeoisie. It's a really, really interesting phrase. I'll stop there.
Yeah, let's start another discussion now on that phrase, shall we? Cheeky indeed. That opens up all sorts of cans of worms. But it is true, and that refers to something that Brian said earlier. I think it's the Communist Manifesto was one of the first clear ideas in terms of explaining that capitalism created its own gravedigger, and that, you know, the sort of the dialectical materialism, that everything contains within it the seed of its own destruction, and that, you know, it is revolutionizing, but it's also created the working class, and that it's the working class that has to overthrow capitalism. It's not, and this is why this one chapter is talking so much about other left trends, which is very interesting. And some of these trends you can still see, as Rob explained. The philanthropes, the charity mongers, and all of that, appealing to the king or the queen or, you know, the president to just be a bit nicer for those poor people below. Or these people writing blueprints. This is what my communism will look like. Follow me, and I shall deliver it to you. And they were very clear. This is not what's going to happen. The working class has to do it for itself, by itself. And this was the first real program, I think, explaining that. Thank you very much for a very interesting contribution and discussion. Rob will now just finally sum up a few things. Lawrence had to leave, unfortunately, but it's been a very, very interesting discussion. Rob.
Yeah. So to conclude, we've delved into Manifesto today, and we've had a good look at some of the kind of problematic elements of translation and things, and that, you know, and I would say I wholeheartedly agree with the kind of view of Lawrence on that. I think he's done did a really good job of it, exposing that translation and how that phrase has been used and abused throughout the kind of history of the left. So I'm glad that came out in discussion. I'd also like to, you know, speak to, you know, John's comments about kind of war angle. And I said at the beginning, you could read Manifesto as a pacifist. You can read it, you can get that reading from it as well, that, you know, the destructive force of war and how capital kind of propagates that. So yeah, I mean, you know, we have a limited time to discuss it, and I would recommend all of you, if you haven't read it, and I assume most people who have spoken have read it, because of course, why wouldn't you? It's this, you know, seminal text of the left-wing movement. If you haven't read it, read it. It's easy to read. It's beautifully written, and the language, you know, you get Marx and Engels kind of, you know, biting sense of humor in various parts. It keeps you engaged and entertained. So you know, and I'll come back onto some of like Will's points there about the gravediggers, you know, kind of idea that the inevitability of socialism, and I think that's definitely not what they were, you know. If you look at the critique of the, you know, of the utopian communists and socialists, that's very much what their problem is with them, is that they don't intend to have any impact on the material conditions for the working class. You know, so the distinction of communism from those people, from that branch of political thought, is the materialistic action, and that it's not inevitable, and it needs all workers to rise up, and you've got nothing to lose but your chains. You know, that it really pushes that historical responsibility onto the working class. So yeah, I think it's been a good discussion, and lots arising from it that we'll bring up in future discussions, hopefully. So great, thanks for the positive comments, everybody, and yeah, hope to do it again next week.
Excellent. Yes, you're on again next week, aren't you? Next week, comrades, we're discussing capital. Slightly more tricky to read than Communist Manifesto. We've published on our website a few bits of literature around capital. If you don't have time to read all 3 volumes before next week, they are a bit heavy. But there is literature that sums up what's the messages of capital, and I've just put it in the chat. It does help to read up before coming to a session, I think, having just done it myself. Comrades, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Excellent discussion, and hope to see many of you next week. Good night.